Fellow readers and booktubers, this is the Roman Emperor's Reading Challenge, Augustus, Part 2. I had posted Part 2 a few weeks ago, and this is my follow-up. And this is about Augustus, specifically kind of a review or a critique of Adrian Goldsworthy's book, Augustus, the First Emperor of Rome. Now, in Part 1, what I attempted to do was to give a broad background of Rome, Roman history up to the time of Augustus. It was not easy to do. A lot of the feedback I got from it, though, was very, very positive, so I was happy to see that. But I thought it important that I give everyone who isn't real familiar with Roman history a good sense of what the Roman Republic was like. Because when Augustus comes in, all of that changes. Augustus is this transitional figure, and you can't really appreciate what he accomplished or what he did unless you know what it was that was changed. Now, I know a lot of you, in addition to reading Mary Beard's book on the Roman emperors, we're also reading Anthony Everett's book on Augustus, which I'd recommended, which is a very good book. And I'd be really interested in hearing what many of you think about this. So with this post, I'm going to include some prompts, and feel free to respond to them in any way you like. If you would just like to put something in the comment section, my booktube email address is available, so you can email me, or you can even post something of your own. So tell me what you think about Augustus by way of Anthony Everett. What I'm going to do is tell you about Adrian Goldsworthy's view of Augustus. I don't think the views would be too different. They're pretty much straight narrative biographies, although they'll be nuanced slightly. I was asked one time by someone, why would you want to read another biography of someone if you've already read an earlier biography of that same person? Because biographers, will always emphasize different things. The particulars will always be the same, the specific events. But, as I said, the nuance will be different. And I know what Everett had to say about Augustus was, in some respects, a little different from what Goldsworthy has to say about him. But I'll be talking about Goldsworthy. And by the way, there's a little blurb here on the cover. I don't know if you can see that. Give it a second to get into focus here. Is it coming into focus? Maybe not. Well, let me read it to you. Superb, a first-rate biography by a skilled and knowing hand. And that is a quote from Steve Donahue, which I believe is our Steve Donahue on BookTube. In fact, I looked up this review on the Washington Post when this book was published. It sure sounds like Steve Donahue of BookTube. So thank you, Steve, for that. And I agree with him, by the way. This is really, really good. It's a hefty book. It covers a lot of ground, but it covers it very, very well. Goldsworthy is a great historian, but then again, so is Anthony Everett. At any rate, let's talk about Augustus a little bit. And since I've already given you some background in Part 1, some things I might have to repeat a little bit or emphasize a little bit more than I did the first time around. But this idea that Augustus is a major figure in the history of ancient Rome because he represents that moment when Rome changed from a republic into a principate. Principate is the fancy word that historians use when they talk about the age of the Roman emperors. Rome was not always governed by emperors. For nearly 500 years, it was governed as a republic. There were annually elected magistrates who made the laws and oversaw the running of the state. There was a Senate, which was an advisory body to the magistrates, and there were the popular assemblies that would elect the magistrates. The Greco-Roman historian Polybius would write that the secret of Rome's success is that they combined the three greatest forms of government: monarchy, that's with the magistrates, aristocracy with the Senate, and democracy with the popular assemblies. At any rate, Rome became an empire, incredibly successful, incredibly powerful, and very prosperous. And then in the first century before Christ, it all begins to implode. Various powerful families begin to vie for power, and Rome is plunged into a series of civil wars, and Roman politics truly becomes a blood sport. This was serious politics with enormous stakes to be had, and people were killing each other over this. And out of this will come Augustus, and he changes everything. even everything from the way the empire is governed to even Rome's cultural and social life. So he's this enormous figure in history, a real agent of change and very powerful change. So for any biographer to try to capture this properly, and I'm talking about popular history. There's a lot of scholarly books about Augustus, and they'll just focus in on one aspect of his life or a certain dimension to the changes that he triggered or a particular change. These are the kind of books or even essays and things you'll find in history journals and things like that. But to write a biography of Augustus directed towards a broad general audience, any historian that tries to do this has really got a huge task at hand. And Goldsworthy and Everett handle this really well. And there are some others too that have handled it well. But one of the big issues, of course, is to prepare the reader for the change that's coming, so the reader can really appreciate what Augustus did. So I often notice in these narrative biographies of Augustus, the first 5, 6, 7 chapters, maybe the first half of the book, it's all about what Rome was like, and then Augustus shows up more or less. So it's quite a challenge for any historian to do that. And in fact, one of the challenges is exactly how do you refer to Augustus, because Augustus, of course, wasn't his name, it was his title. And Everett handles it in one way. Goldsworthy handles it in a slightly different way. So first of all, what do we call this guy? Augustus is a title, it's not a name. Here's a couple things to be understood here. And it has a lot to do with the construction of the Roman name. And that's another field of study when you study Rome. The tria nomina, the 3 names that the Roman aristocracy had, and how names often reveal things about an individual's background and even their social status. Let me just lay this out for you, and I'll strip this down a little bit. First of all, Julius Caesar, the famous Julius Caesar, the guy who was assassinated on March 15th in 44 BC, he had a sister named Julia. Now, right away, you'll notice something here. Julius, Julia. The Romans were not real creative with the names. There's a lot of Juliuses, there's a lot of Gaiuses, there's a lot of Claudiuses, and then if there was a female member of the family, they would get the feminine version of the male name. So Julius Caesar, his sister's name was Julia. Okay, so Julius Caesar had a sister. Now, Caesar himself did not have any children, at least none that we know of, except for a daughter. Also, and more importantly, he didn't have a son. Now, some of you might be aware that he did have a son by Cleopatra, referred to as Caesarion. But in terms of who would inherit Julius Caesar's wealth and property and power, it couldn't be the son that he had by Cleopatra, because by Roman standards, that son was not a full-blooded Roman. He was part Egyptian. So Caesar had to find someone, he had to adopt someone within his family to be the heir apparent, to be the inheritor of all of his great wealth. So it works like this. Julius Caesar has a sister named Julia. Julia was married to Marcus Attius Balbus, who was a praetor. A praetor is a high-ranking official in the Roman government. All right. So Julia and Marcus Balbus married, and they had a daughter. And the daughter's name was Atia, A-T-I-A. Atia married Gaius Octavius, who was also a praetor, another high-ranking member in the Roman government. And they had 2 children, a son named Octavian and a daughter named, guess what, Octavia. Okay, Octavian, that's our boy. So Octavian was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. I'm not sure, I don't recall in the Everett book, but I know in the Goldsworthy book, and In fact, if you even just go online and look at this, you'll see the family tree of Julius Caesar and then Octavian becoming Augustus and then all of his family. This is, the Roman families were always extended families. There was a lot of adoption that happened. And when you look at the family of Julius Caesar and his many descendants, which includes Augustus and then a lot of the first 3 or 4 emperors of Rome, to try to untangle that family tree. Imagine if you were to take a handful of wet spaghetti and throw it against the wall and then try to untangle all the different strands. That's what this is like. But at any rate, so Julius Caesar's grandnephew is Octavian. Now, as I said, adoption was very common among the Romans. And sometimes it would be done for political reasons. A lot of the time it was done for reasons of ownership, property, legacy, and things like this. All right? Because Caesar had no legitimate son, he adopts his grandnephew, Octavian, because he had a fondness for the boy. All right? Once he adopts him, the boy's name then becomes Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Because Gaius Octavian was his birth name. Once he gets adopted, he gets his great uncle's name, so then it becomes Gaius Julius Caesar, and then Octavian, they add on the IUS at the end of the name to alert anyone looking at a legal document that this kid was an Octavian, but he was adopted into the family of Julius Caesar. So he's not Octavian, he's Octavianus. It gets a little complicated from there, but that's so. But the issue here is, what are we going to call him? Is he Octavian? Is he Octavius? Is he Augustus? Augustus is a title that's given to him much later on in his life. Now, what Goldsworthy does, Goldsworthy notes that Augustus will refer to himself as Gaius Caesar from as soon as he enters the political arena, playing on the name of his famous, adopted father, I guess, because Caesar, that name becomes quite significant to the Romans. It's the great and mighty Caesar. So through his entire life, Octavian will refer to himself as Gaius Caesar. Okay. And so Goldsworthy says, I'm going to refer to him as Caesar because that's how he referred to himself. And that's fine. It can get a little tricky though. And I notice that Goldsworthy will go to great lengths to remind you that when he says Caesar, he doesn't mean the famous Julius Caesar. He means the adopted son of Caesar who will become Augustus. All right. I notice in Everett's book, he'll refer to this individual as Octavian, Octavius, as Caesar, as Augustus, depending upon what moment in his life is being discussed at the time. I know this gets a little goofy. It can be kind of overwhelming. When you get good historians like Everett and Goldsworthy, though, they really help you through this, probably much better than I'm doing it. For the purposes of this post, though, I'm just going to call him Augustus. It's a lot easier, and I think it can just clear away a lot of confusion. But do keep in mind, Augustus is a title. It's not really his name, okay? He was a Caesar, very much so. Now, the major events in his life, both books, any book on Augustus will, they often include a little chronological chart, either at the beginning or the end of the book. And then the book itself will kind of flesh out these major events. We don't need to go through all of them, but I do want to hit on some of the major points here. Augustus, I'm going to call him Augustus, he was born on September 23rd, 63 BC. And there were all kinds of supernatural events attendant on his birth. Very common in antiquity. Chances are these things didn't really happen quite the way they're described, but there's always this sense that this individual was somehow destined to be powerful and great. We know at a very young age, Octavius, or Augustus, I should say, becomes the favorite of his famous great uncle, Julius Caesar, and he goes with Julius Caesar on a triumphal parade through the streets of Rome. Caesar had a great fondness for his grandnephew. 44 BC, Julius Caesar is assassinated. Octavius, or Augustus, at that time he's 19 years old. He's in Greece. He's he's in what is now called Albania. He's completing his academic and military studies when he gets word that his father, Julius Caesar, has been assassinated. So he heads to Italy and then to Rome. And when he gets there, he finds out that Julius Caesar had mentioned him in his will, prominently in his will, and named him his chief personal heir. Octavian secures official recognition as Caesar's adopted son, and he begins to refer to himself as Gaius Julius Caesar. So he appears on the scene. Now, the assassination of Julius Caesar, the assassins, it was a group of Roman senators led by Brutus and Cassius. It seemed like their idea was just to kill Caesar, and then the Roman Republic would somehow magically reconstitute itself. But that's not what happened. By the time Caesar had been assassinated, he had accrued so much power, he had centralized the government of the empire so completely that his sudden removal created a power vacuum. One of Caesar's close associates, Mark Antony, attempted to fill that power vacuum, apparently not counting on the fact that the 19-year-old Augustus was going to show up on the scene wanting his inheritance, which was easily most of the wealth of the Roman Empire. So you get this moment of great tension between these two men. All right. Cicero, the famous Marcus Tullius Cicero, was hoping to convince Augustus to restore the Republic. And for a short time there, it looked like there would be a civil war between Augustus and Mark Antony over control of the empire, and with Cicero kind of encouraging this to happen by trying to convince Augustus that Mark Antony was not a good guy. Unfortunately, Augustus decides to throw his lot in with Mark Antony, and the two of them, with the help of another Roman by the name of Lepidus, who was another associate of Julius Caesar, the three of them will form what is known as the Second Triumvirate. The first triumvirate occurred much earlier. That was Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. A triumvirate just means like a three-man governing body. It wasn't a legal construct. It was just a three-man conspiracy, more or less. And so this will be the second triumvirate. The first one disintegrated when Crassus, the richest man in Rome, was killed in a battle in the east against the Parthians. And then it came down to Pompey and Julius Caesar. They fought. Caesar emerged triumphant. Caesar becomes the great ruler. And then, of course, he gets assassinated. So now Caesar's descendant, his adopted son, Augustus, joins forces with Mark Antony and Lepidus, two other associates of Julius Caesar, to form the second triumvirate. And what they're going to do is divide the empire up three ways among them. Okay? Once this agreement was made between these three men, the slaughter begins. They target any political resistors and have them hunted down and murdered. They'll issue what would be known as the proscriptions. A proscription is kind of an enemies list. You end up on this list and you are now marked for death. And whoever hunts you down and kills you will then be allowed to seize your property. So, there is a great incentive here to kill or hunt down and murder anyone who was proscribed. How many people were killed in this? Thousands, tens of thousands. It was a slaughter. It was a nightmarish event. It had happened once before in Roman history. What was Augustus's view of this? Some sources say that Augustus was appalled by this. He's still a very young man. And this idea of just this almost indiscriminate slaughter of political opponents seemed to have upset him quite a bit. Other sources, though, say he was all for it. He was very much in favor of this. And, it's impossible to know really how he felt about it, although Goldsworthy and others will point out that early on in Octavian's ascent to power, he seemed quite bloodthirsty. He seemed quite willing to use extreme measures to seize the power for himself. We know that Mark Antony and Lepidus seem to be very much in favor of drawing up this list. It was during these proscriptions, by the way, that Cicero was assassinated. Later on, Augustus will claim that he didn't know Cicero's name was on the list. It was believed that it was Mark Antony that targeted Cicero for assassination because Antony and Cicero hated each other. But again, we'll never know. At any rate, after the proscriptions, things begin to settle down a bit. However, the assassins of Julius Caesar, or the leaders of that conspiracy, Brutus and Cassius, they're east, they're in Greece, and they're amassing legions of their own. Augustus, Octavian, he has the cultural responsibility for avenging his father's death. So Octavian and Mark Antony, and they gather up their legions, they head east and to do battle against Brutus and Cassius. The year is 42 BC. It's in northern Greece at Philippi. It's the Battle of Philippi. Those of you who come from a Christian background may be familiar with St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, written about a century later. The Philippians are the people of Philippi. This was a very important city in the Roman Empire and in Roman history. So anyway, at the Battle of Philippi, you've got the two sides. You've got Augustus and Mark Antony on one side, battling Brutus and Cassius on the other. It's a pivotal moment in Roman history because Augustus and Mark Antony emerge triumphant. Brutus and Cassius, they commit suicide. The battle goes very badly for them, and in their despair, they kill themselves, and so this kind of brings about the end of the last of the defenders of the Republic, Brutus and Cassius. It's a really interesting battle. It's covered pretty well in military histories, but Goldsworthy makes an interesting observation here, is that the two armies fighting each other were not well directed. Mark Antony and Octavian, well, first of all, Octavian had very little military experience. Mark Antony did have military experience, but he wasn't a good strategist. His general idea seemed to be amass the largest army you can and just throw them against your enemy and hope for the best. So Mark Antony was not a good general, and Goldsworthy mentions this a number of times in his biography of Augustus. I just want to quote here from Goldsworthy. This is on page 138. This was a war fought by large and clumsy armies where none of the senior officers had experience of warfare on so grand a scale. In fact, it was believed that the armies taken together were the two largest Roman armies ever amassed in Roman history. And also it was during this battle that at a key moment, Augustus seems to disappear from the field of action. He's in his tent. He's feeling ill. He's kind of sick. Augustus was plagued with some kind of unnamed illness his entire life. He's not always sick, but he has these spells where he'll get very ill. We don't know what that is. However, there were rumors as time went by that he was a coward. Every time there was a major battle to take place, he's not always in the forefront. He's always hanging back somewhere. Again, this is one of those interpretive things. I mean, how do we know? At any rate, the battle is a very decisive battle, and the second triumvirate wins. Brutus and Cassius are now done and finished, and so Augustus and Mark Antony and Lepidus are free to divide the empire three ways. Augustus will get the western half of the empire, which will be governed from the city of Rome itself. Very significant. Mark Antony gets the eastern half of the empire, which includes Greece and Egypt. Lepidus gets parts of North Africa. Antony and Augustus never truly trusted Lepidus, and probably for good reason, because Lepidus will eventually push back against this. He felt like he had been shorted, and then Augustus will defeat Lepidus in a battle a little bit later on. Lepidus is sent into exile, and Augustus absorbs his part of the deal. So then the empire will be divided just two ways between Augustus and Mark Antony. And that kind of works out fairly well for a few years. Mark Antony he travels throughout the western half of the empire, visiting the various provinces. These are some of the wealthiest provinces, or not provinces, the wealthiest kingdoms, the client kingdoms of the Roman Empire. Little side note here. The Roman provinces, those are the western half. Those are how the western half of the empire was divided into provinces. Each province had its own governor. The eastern half of the empire were these old Hellenistic kings, and the Romans would support those kings provided the kings were loyal to Rome. Okay? So Mark Antony is traveling through the eastern half of the empire, visiting these Hellenistic kings and enjoying all the gifts and the wealth and the wine and the women and song that they have to offer. And eventually he ends up in Egypt, and guess who he meets? He meets Cleopatra. Cleopatra had earlier seduced Julius Caesar with the hopes of trying to convince Caesar to help her recreate a kind of an Egyptian empire. Of course, that failed with the death of Caesar. So now Cleopatra seduces Mark Antony. And Mark Antony, deep into his cups, as they say, Mark Antony was apparently an alcoholic. He loved to drink. And he falls for Cleopatra's charms. They begin to cohabit, let's say. They may have married, but it would not have been a marriage that would have been recognized as legitimate in the Roman courts. And they have a number of children. The problem with this is Mark Antony was already married. He was married to Octavia, Octavian, Augustus's sister. And she complained to her brother that Mark Antony is bringing a great scandal on the house of Caesar. And that was something that had to be defended. But also, it seemed as if what Mark Antony was planning on doing was, there were rumors he had written his will, and that upon his death, his property would go to the children he had by way of Cleopatra. Mark Antony's property was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. This was too much for Augustus to tolerate, and the Senate and the people of Rome were outraged by this. So in the year 31 BC, September 3rd, 31 BC, Augustus, with the assistance of his very capable friend Agrippa, who was the true military man here. Augustus was never much of a military man, but Agrippa was a really great general and strategist. Augustus and Agrippa sail just off the coast of Greece near the city of Actium, and there they meet Mark Antony with Cleopatra and his armies. Antony's armies are all Roman legions. Augustus's and Agrippa's armies are all Roman legions. This is a civil war on a massive scale. This is the Battle of Actium. It does not go well for Mark Antony and Cleopatra. In fact, they both, when it becomes very clear that they're going to lose, in fact, a lot of Mark Antony's soldiers, they don't want to fight Augustus. They lay down their arms or they run over to the other side. So Mark Antony abandons his legions, heads back down to Egypt with Cleopatra. About a year later, the two of them will commit suicide. And with that, Augustus is now the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Okay? And it was just a couple years after that that Augustus is given the name Augustus, meaning the honored one, the glorious one. And from that point on, Augustus will engage in a lot of reforms to the Roman Empire. He consolidates many things. He pushes out the frontiers of the empire. There are a number of, there's some pushback, but generally speaking, as time goes by, Augustus becomes more and more beloved by the Roman people. He undergoes something of a change in personality. Early on, when he was young, he was quite ruthless in amassing power, but once he has the ultimate power, he seems a bit more relaxed. As I said, there are other battles to be fought, but Rome just overwhelms any resistance. Augustus eases into his power, consolidates the empire, changes a lot of things. There's one major disruption very much near the end of Augustus's life, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, which occurs in the year 9 AD. This is a couple Roman legions were tricked into crossing the Rhine River, where they're ambushed by some Germanic tribes and they're wiped out to a man. And with that, Augustus will proclaim that the Roman Empire will never extend east of the Rhine or north of the Danube. Those are the boundaries of Germania or Germany. Germany is never part of the Roman Empire because of that proclamation of Augustus. Okay, but aside from that, the empire seems to be entering into a period of stability. In the upper echelons of power, there's going to be a lot of drama, family stuff. But as far as the governance of the empire, beginning with Augustus, who will rule for over 40 years, we enter into a period known as the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. It will last nearly 200 years. And generally speaking, relatively speaking, if you're a Roman citizen at any time during those 2 centuries, things are pretty sweet. Rome is in its golden age. So Augustus being this transitional figure, that's another thing. He takes Rome from a period of incredible confusion and civil war, and he inaugurates an age of peace and prosperity for the Roman people. Augustus dies on the 19th of August in the year 14. He's near the city of Naples in southern Italy. He's 75 years old. And not long after his death, in fact, just a couple weeks after that, he is declared a god. And by the way, I should mention that as Augustus was rising to power, his famous father, Julius Caesar, was also declared a god. And when that happened, and Augustus was still alive at the time, Augustus then becomes the son of a god. This idea of a mortal being a son of a god, that wasn't something too unusual in the Roman or the classical mentality. And if you notice the change of dates here, it was during the closing years of Augustus's rule that in that little town of Bethlehem, a Jewish, the son of an itinerant Jewish carpenter, his name will be Jesus of Nazareth, is born. It will be called the Son of God by his believers. Now, that event would have been completely obscure to Augustus and the people of Rome and the empire. That's the beginnings of Christianity, but none of that is noticed. It means nothing to them. These are just this poor family tucked away in a corner of the empire. But it is interesting to think of this concept of a son of a god was already in the zeitgeist of the time, which might explain why it wasn't that difficult for Jesus to convince his followers that he was a son of a god too. That's to get way off the subject. This is the story of Augustus, and it doesn't really involve Jesus at all. So in this grand story, and we just skimmed the surface here, there's a lot of activity, a lot of interesting anecdotes, and Goldsworthy really, fills in the gaps in a very colorful way. Goldsworthy has a real mastery of Roman history. He discusses how the military fought their wars, what life was like in the Roman Empire at this time for the wealthy and for the poor, the Roman economy. Everett does the same thing because there's so much to be said. This is a period of Roman history that we know a lot about. There are still gaps in our knowledge, but at this one moment, there's a lot that we do know. And it's really quite fascinating. One of the big things about Augustus is that he does consolidate the empire, and he creates a kind of uniform governance of the empire, especially when it came to the collection of taxes. Before all of that happened, as the Roman Empire was developing, it wasn't developing based upon any kind of game plan. The Romans didn't have a blueprint. And so as they began to acquire more and more territory, how do you govern these territories? How do you collect taxes? What do you do with the people in these territories? The Romans, over the few centuries that they created their empire, they just kind of made it up as they went along. And so by the time of Augustus, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of tension as to how, what's the most efficient way of governing an empire. And Augustus creates a very efficient system, a very uniform system, especially in the collection of taxes. And so that brought a lot of peace to the empire. And so that's a big thing to be said about Augustus. He had this understanding of the importance of uniformity. And so Goldsworthy says this is an aspect of Augustus's personality. Because, what kind of man was he? Early on, when he's in his late teens, he's quite ruthless, he's quite bloodthirsty. However, once he settles into his power, he seems to mellow out quite a bit. As a military leader, as I said, there were those hints of cowardice, but he seems fairly adequate. He was also very lucky. That's another thing that Goldsworthy brings us out too. He was very lucky. Of course, in the ancient world, luck was a sign that you were blessed by the gods, so you've got that happening as well. Mostly, though, the thing Goldsworthy repeats the most about, he mentions most often about Augustus, was that he was very, very ambitious. He was ambitious. He seemed unusually confident at a very young period in his life, and that confidence carried him through, and had very high self-esteem. All right. He was a great patron of the arts, very common among the aristocracy. It spoke very well of an aristocrat to be an admirer of literature and poetry, and Augustus was certainly that. He was the patron of some of the great Roman poets, Horace, Ovid, and of course Virgil. All right. He corresponded regularly with Atticus, who had been a friend of Cicero as well. Atticus was the leading Roman literati of the time, and Augustus was great friends with him. As Goldsworthy will note, I'm quoting here, Augustus had a great respect for history and tradition, which represented a softer side. Okay, he also, once he had a secure grasp of power, he does try to reinforce the Roman cultic system. The Romans had developed a real cynical attitude towards their gods, but Augustus will have a lot of the old temples refurbished and rebuilt. In the first century leading up to Augustus's moment of power and glory, the Roman culture, the Roman society was in pretty shabby, in bad shape, let's just say. Divorce was very common, and there was a lot of sexual immorality, even from the Roman perspective. So Augustus tried to bring that back. Stay true to your family, keep the family unit together. It was the Romans who had that famous expression, "As the family goes, so goes Rome." And so he really tried to enforce this. Unfortunately, Augustus's only child was a daughter, and his daughter Julia was quite kind of a party girl, and this was very embarrassing to Augustus. But there's a couple interesting things here that Goldsworthy points out. At one point, Augustus finds out that his daughter has been, let's just say, sleeping around with a great many men. And Augustus is very angered by this, and he sends his daughter Julia into exile. Right? And the men who had affairs with her, he also kind of exiles them as well. And Goldsworthy says, it's interesting that Augustus, he could have ordered the death of the execution of his daughter. He is the father of this family, and the Roman father of the family had tremendous power over his children. He could have ordered the execution of the men who had affairs with his daughter, but he doesn't do that. He just sends everyone in exile. He sends them all away. Okay. One of the lovers of his daughter, though, is encouraged to commit suicide, which he does. But Goldsworthy reads this as this idea that Augustus was more hurt by this. He was ashamed of this rather than enraged by it. And Goldsworthy takes this approach quite a bit with other characters here, particularly Augustus's wife Livia, who a lot of times in other biographies, and even the biographies written by the Romans themselves, Livia is seen as this rather untrustworthy, unsavory character who was poisoning people so that there wouldn't be any rivals to her son's bid for power. Livia had a son named Tiberius from a previous marriage. And in fact, even in modern fictional accounts, Robert Graves' famous novel, I, Claudius and Claudius the God, suggests that Livia was poisoning people to get ahead, and that she perhaps even poisoned Augustus himself. Goldsworthy just shoots that down. He says there's no evidence of this. And in fact, in Roman society, it was very common for the aristocracy to divorce and remarry and divorce and remarry over and over again. But once Augustus, who had a reputation for seducing other men's wives, he marries Livia at a very young age, and he never divorces her. They stay together, and they seem to have a genuine fondness for each other. There was political stuff behind this. Livia came from the Claudian family, a very old and greatly respected aristocratic family. So there's that political thing and there's that social thing, and yet they seemed to have a genuine fondness there. And so Goldsworthy really dismisses this whole idea that Livia was this conniving harpy type and all this. And Goldsworthy will do that quite a bit. He takes a more balanced view of things. What is Goldsworthy's ultimate view of Augustus? Was he a good ruler? Yeah. I mean, he brought peace to the empire at a tremendous cost and rivers of blood, but once he restored peace, he comes across as quite a cultured man, a man of great patience. Everything he did, he actually did do for the benefit of the Roman people. He was very available to the Roman people. You could petition Augustus directly, face to face, if you could get in to see him. And he was very patient. We even hear he has a sense of humor. Upon his death, he's hailed as a god. He'll be remembered as the greatest of the Roman emperors. He's the first and the greatest. And so a complex character, in some ways, kind of he's kind of enigmatic. He's kind of an elusive character, but that's just because we don't quite have as much information as we would like. But what we do have, and if it's balanced out evenly the way Goldsworthy balances it out, Augustus comes across as, okay, a good ruler. I don't think the kind of ruler that would be tolerated today, but by ancient standards and by Roman standards, he was no tyrant. All right, he was a god. We'll just leave it at that. Now, for those of you who read Everett's book or any book on Augustus, as I said, I'll put some prompts below and you can respond to them in any way you like. I would love to hear from you all. But that's going to conclude my post on Augustus. The next Roman emperor, the second Roman emperor, the second emperor of Rome will be Tiberius, the adopted son of Augustus. Now, you're not going to find as many biographies of Tiberius, or at least not as many popular biographies of Tiberius. It's not that he's that mysterious of a figure, but he's very complex. And he comes to the purple. He becomes emperor rather late in his life. And a lot of the books written about Tiberius are more the academic sort. But feel free to tackle it if you like. If you've read about Augustus, you pretty much have some good background now into Roman politics and all that, so maybe a more scholarly approach you can handle. But there are some you'll be able to handle it without any problem. There are some great popular biographies of Tiberius, but not as many. I know here's one. There's a new one coming out that's going to be published in a couple of months. I know nothing about it other than it's coming. That looks like a good popular one if you want to hang in there for a few months. This is one that was published just recently, Tiberius and His Age, Myth, Sex, Luxury, and Power by Edward Camplin. I haven't read this yet. It does advertise itself as a revisionist history. Sometimes revisionist histories can be very good. Sometimes they can just be unnecessarily sensationalistic. So I don't know which kind of revisionist history this is. So I'm not sure I would recommend this one. One of those really scholarly books, though, is this one by Barbara Levick, who's a great Roman historian. This is Tiberius, the politician. Again, I think if you've read a good biography of Augustus, you could, tackle the more serious, the more academic type thing that graduate students would have to read. And Barbara Levick, she wrote a lot about Roman history. She's really good. Not as approachable as, say, Mary Beard is, but interesting nonetheless. But I think the book I'm going to read for my Roman Emperors Reading Challenge, though, will be this one. I just ordered a copy of it by Robin Sager. It's just called Tiberius. Here's a picture of the cover. My technological skills aren't the best. But this is supposed to be quite good. Robin Sager was a wonderful historian. I think he's still alive, or maybe not. But I'll be going with this one for Tiberius. So that's it for now. The prompts I'm going to put below here, I'm going to just ask if you'd like to share the name of the biography of Augustus and who the historian was that wrote it. If you read the Everett one, that's fine. If you read Goldsworthy, or maybe you found another one that was even more intriguing and interesting to you. So tell me, share with everybody which biography you read. Did you think it was a good biography? Was it informative? Was it interesting? Did it hold your interest? Some historians are not real good writers. So did you pick a biography that you found so insanely boring that you couldn't quite finish it? That's fine too. I'd like to hear about that. And then, of course, your own opinion about Augustus. Now that you've read his life story, what do you think of him? Do you think he was a good military leader? Do you think he was a good emperor? Was he a good politician? Okay. What do you think were his strengths and weaknesses? And then I couldn't help myself. I had to throw in the perennial question, the perennial dinner guest question. If you could invite someone to dinner, someone from history, living or dead, who would you invite? Would you invite Augustus to dinner? And if you would, why would you do that? And what would you ask him if you had a chance to talk to him? If you had an opportunity to invite Augustus and you said, no way, I don't want that man in my house, I am not sitting down to dinner with him, well, why would that be? Why would you refuse to invite him? I think you can have some fun with that one. But that's it for the Roman Emperor's Reading Challenge in terms of Augustus. Hope you enjoyed this. I went a little long. There was a lot to be said. But the next emperor we'll be covering will be the second emperor of Rome, Tiberius. If you have any questions, or if you want to just discuss things, or you've got the comments section, and you can always email. I'll be more than happy. I would love to hear from all of you about what you think about this. It's a huge topic. I know it's very involved and very complex, but it's also a lot of fun, and it can be incredibly entertaining. And I hope you found this post entertaining. So that's it for now. Keep reading, stay strong, and stay healthy, and be good to yourself.